Welcome, everyone. If I haven't had the pleasure of meeting you, I'm Rob Vischer. I'm the dean here at St. Thomas Law, and we're glad to those of you who have been able to join us on site in downtown Minneapolis. We also welcome those who are joining us online. We are honored to host this afternoon's conversation. I think it's fitting that as a Catholic law school, we are deeply invested in restorative justice efforts. In fact, I think we're compelled as a Catholic law school to be deeply invested in restorative justice efforts. By way of explanation, I'll briefly offer 4 insights from Pope Francis's recent encyclical Fratelli Tutti to underscore how vital this work is for us. First, one of Pope Francis's takeaway lessons from this encyclical is the importance of dialogue, that dialogue is difficult but essential. He writes that dialogue, quote, calls for perseverance. It entails moments of silence and suffering, yet it can patiently embrace the broader experience of individuals and peoples. When our conversations revolve only around the latest data, they become merely horizontal and cumulative. We fail to keep our attention focused, to penetrate to the heart of matters, and to recognize what is essential to give meaning to our lives. Freedom thus becomes an illusion that we are peddled, easily confused with the ability to navigate the internet. The process of building fraternity, be it local or universal, can only be undertaken by spirits that are free and open to authentic encounters. Okay, so first, dialogue is difficult but essential. So we cannot shirk when we realize it's difficult. Of course it's difficult. Second, our respect for the dignity of others must be unconditional. Again, Pope Francis writes, at a time when various forms of fundamentalist intolerance are damaging relationships between individuals, groups, and peoples, let us be committed to living and teaching the value of respect for others, a love capable of welcoming differences, and the priority of the dignity of every human being over his or her ideas, opinions, practices, and even sins. Despite the forms of fanaticism, closed-mindedness, and social and cultural fragmentation that proliferate in present-day society. In other words, we are not called to win the argument. We are called to be in relationship. Third, efficiency is not always our top priority. Pope Francis puts it simply, quote, loving the most insignificant of human beings as a brother, as if there were no one else in the world but him, cannot be considered a waste of time. We must realize, quote, that what is important is not constantly achieving great results, since these are not always possible. It is truly noble to place our hope in the hidden power of the seeds of goodness we sow, and thus to initiate processes whose fruits will be reaped by others. Of course, we have to think about systems when we're concerned about justice, as we are at a law school. But we can't let our focus on systems obscure the needs of the person sitting before us. Fourth and finally, Pope Francis centers this encyclical on the parable of the Good Samaritan. And that parable reminds us, in Pope Francis's words, to, quote, shoulder the inevitable responsibilities of life as it is. Faced with so much pain and suffering, our only course is to imitate the Good Samaritan, Pope Francis writes, as to do otherwise would make us either one of the robbers or one of those who walked by without showing compassion for the sufferings of the man on the roadside. We must remember that a community can be rebuilt by men and women who identify with the vulnerability of others, who reject the creation of a society of exclusion, and act instead as neighbors, lifting up and rehabilitating the fallen for the sake of the common good. Solidarity, according to Francis, quote, always looks to the faces of the most vulnerable, touches their flesh, senses their closeness, and even in some cases suffers that closeness and tries to help them. Service is never ideological, for we do not serve ideas, we serve people. So with restorative justice, we are not retreating to abstractions and generalities. We are leaning into the pain. We're entering the wound. We're walking with others through life as it is. This is not an easy lift by any stretch. Thankfully, we have expert guides for our journey today. Beginning to my right here, Father Christopher Collins is the Vice President of Mission at the University of St. Thomas. He served from 2012 to 2020 at St. Louis University as a faculty member in the Department of Theological Studies, as Director of the Catholic Studies Program, and as Assistant to the President for Mission and Identity. He earned a BA in philosophy from St. Thomas, an MA in history from St. Louis, Masters of Divinity and Licentiate from Weston Jesuit School of Theology, and a doctorate in sacred theology from Boston College. He was ordained in 2006 and made his final vows as a Jesuit in 2015. He serves on the advisory board of the Initiative on Restorative Justice and Healing here at St. Thomas Law. Rabbi Marcia Zimmerman was hired as an assistant rabbi in 1988 and in 2001 was named senior rabbi at Temple Israel, making her the first woman senior rabbi of a congregation of more than 2,000 families in the United States. She's a graduate of Macalester and Hebrew Union College in New York City. She says of her Temple Israel's Minneapolis location, quote, "Our address is our mission and vision." She has been part of a group of senior clergy of the downtown congregations who engage in social media to fight hate and the blaming that is expressed on digital platforms. Rabbi Zimmerman has said, quote, "Our message is that we are one community, that we move toward finding each other, learning from each other's differences, and making sure we stay connected. We're eager to do that and to be part of solving some of these social ills of scapegoating, trying to find simple answers for complex issues, and helping people deal with their fears in a more constructive way." Next to Rabbi Zimmerman, Gaye Massey is the CEO of YWCA St. Paul, which promotes racial justice through education and advocacy and supports women and their families through programs in support of housing, workforce readiness and career pathways, and youth employment and empowerment. The YWCA also operates a health and fitness center. Prior to her role with the YWCA St. Paul, Ms. Massey served as Senior Deputy General Counsel for United Health Group and General Counsel of its Ovations Division. Before joining UHG, she served as Vice President and General Counsel for Qual Choice Health Plan, was a Senior Counsel at Aetna, and practiced with the law firm of Crowell & Mooring in Washington. And then finally, we're glad to be joined by Commissioner John Harrington, who was appointed Commissioner of the Minnesota Department of Public Safety by Governor Walz in January 2019. Prior to his appointment, he served as the Metro Transit Chief of Police for the Twin Cities, and before that, he had a long career with the St. Paul Police Department, working his way up from patrol officer to Chief of Police, serving as Chief from 2004 until 2010. As chief, he developed innovative programs that have reduced domestic violence and gang involvement. Commissioner Harrington also served as a Minnesota State Senator from the east side of St. Paul from 2010 to 2012 and has been on the faculty at Metro State, St. Mary's, and St. Thomas, where he has taught leadership, demographics, community-oriented policing, and gangs. I'm now going to turn it over to our moderator, Father Dan Griffith. Father Griffith is the Wenger Family Faculty Fellow at St. Thomas Law and serves as the director of our Initiative on Restorative Justice and Healing. He is also the pastor of Our Lady of Lourdes, and starting in July, will serve as pastor of the Basilica of St. Mary. Please join me in welcoming our distinguished panelists and Father Dan Griffith.
Thank you to Dean Vischer for those inspiring words and really beautiful words and challenging words from Pope Francis, who has been an inspiring leader and, like Father Collins, a wise Jesuit. Thank you also to Dean Vischer for his strong support of restorative justice at the St. Thomas Law School, and know of our prayers, Dean Vischer, in support as you begin your new role as interim president of St. Thomas next month. Thank you all for your attendance today, and thanks to those who are attending via our live stream online. And a hearty thank you to our panelists for the commitment of time and for sharing their wisdom with us today. I told them that this was our dream team, the 4 folks that I invited, and they all said yes. And I think the Spirit has been leading us in this direction. We will get to questions for our panelists soon, but I wanted to begin with a brief introduction of the initiative on restorative justice and healing, and also further set the stage for our conversation. The initiative on restorative justice and healing launched last September here at St. Thomas School of Law, and we have been heartened and humbled by the response that our work has received thus far. IRJH seeks to name and help heal harm that results from institutional and leadership failures, racial injustice, and polarization. Our threefold focus applies both to the Catholic Church and also broader society. Since our launch, IRJH has hosted a variety of programs and webinars. In October, we took up the topic of the intersection of racial justice and restorative justice here in the law school atrium, and it included a stirring talk by our colleague, Dr. Yohuru Williams. In November, we hosted a webinar with 3 centrists who have skillfully built bridges across political and cultural divides in an effort to overcome polarization. In January, we hosted a moving panel called Wisdom from the Wound, which brought together victim survivors and victim advocates in response to the scourge of clergy abuse and leadership failures in the Catholic Church. Wisdom and needed perspective abounded from the group that were part of that panel. In March, Associate Director of IRJH, Julie Craven, hosted an excellent webinar called When the Practice Pivoted, looking at the fruitful nexus of technology and restorative justice as a result of the pandemic. The work of IRJH, which also includes a law school course and a coming practicum experience for students, is rooted in the principles of restorative justice, which owes its beginning and foundation to the First Nation peoples of North America and New Zealand. Restorative justice asks 3 fundamental questions. Who was harmed? What is the nature of the harm? And how can the harm be repaired? RJ, as it is often called by practitioners, has become a worldwide movement across multiple professions and disciplines, largely because of its effectiveness and its adaptability. When introduced to law students, we have found that RJ helps them become better lawyers, deeper listeners, more compassionate, more open, and more willing to think outside of the box in response to harm, not something lawyers are typically trained to do. Our initiative is also rooted in the Catholic intellectual tradition and biblical justice. I and others have found a natural dynamism and positive potential when restorative justice is paired with Catholic social teaching. Both include a prophetic dimension in response to harm, and both are aimed at fostering justice, healing, and human flourishing. Today marks the final program of the school year, and it has been a tremendous first year for the initiative, something that Julie and I and our leadership team are very thankful for. I'd like to thank the Basilica of St. Mary, including Father John Bauer and the staff. There's a number of parishioners here as well and staff members. Also the University of St. Thomas Office of Mission, which is headed up by Father Chris Collins. Both are co-sponsors for today's program, Justice and Healing for a Wounded Community, a conversation with civic and religious leaders. I'd like to thank the St. Thomas Law team for all their help with today's event, including my colleague Julie Craven, whose passion and work with the initiative have been instrumental to our successful launch and terrific first year. Many in the country were deeply saddened by the senseless and brutal killing of our brothers and sisters in Buffalo, New York over the weekend. Targeted and gunned down for one reason: the color of their skin? When will the madness stop? When will hearts be transformed from hate to love, from fear to inclusion? Here in the Twin Cities, we are a wounded community. Next week will mark the second anniversary of the murder of George Floyd and the attendant tumult here and throughout our country. Minnesota suffers from some of the most acute racial disparities in the nation across multiple categories. The home ownership gap in Minneapolis between white and black residents is staggering. So too is the income gap. What are we doing about these persistent and significant disparities in our wounded community? These manifest injustices are seeded, sadly, into the cultural soil of our state, and the resulting harm must be named, stopped, and healed. Many in Minnesota are also rightly concerned with the rise in crime and the dearth of available police officers. But we must also confront the need for greater police reform and accountability and the underlying issues of justice that result in generational harm and in some of our communities, a privation of a sense of hope that should attend every human life. We are faced, to be sure, with complex problems in our community. The panelists for today's program are wise and experienced and thoughtful leaders in society and in their faith communities. And we are very, very happy that they're with us today. I'd like to just briefly say how we're going to do our panel, outline the program. You all have pieces of paper on your table, and you're welcome to write questions. We'll go for about 45, 50 minutes of questions that I have sent the panelists. And I've told them that this is not to be a rigid program. So we want to follow the spirit. You can comment back and forth from each other, and if you don't want to answer my question and you think there's a better question, then go for it. The idea is openness and the dialogue that Dean Vischer spoke of in the introduction. And so what we'll do at about 5:20, 5:25 is we'll collect the questions from the folks who are here. We also have a robust group. About half our group today is online. And so I'll put your questions to the panelists, and we'll have folks collect the questions and bring them up. We also invite you to stay after the program and continue the conversation. This is really important that we enter into dialogue as a community, and I again thank all of you for your presence here. Okay, first question to the panelists, and what we'll do is we'll begin with Father Collins, but then as we get to Commissioner Harrington, the next question will begin down on the other side of our panel. So the first question is to all of the panelists: what are the greatest challenges we currently face in the Twin Cities and in Minnesota? What is kind of most on your heart and on your mind in terms of issues of justice, issues of the common good that really need to be attended to, including things that we might not first think of, those things kind of underlying our present circumstances that you want to bring forward. Father Collins.
Great, thank you. And I want to say right off the bat, I feel like more than a little bit of a fraud on this because I've only moved here in the last year, and I was in St. Louis for 8 years. And so I can't help but have a lot of my kind of worldview on the kinds of things that I know are not the same here, but perhaps could be translated in other ways. And it's also been, we were talking earlier, been working on since I got here, trying to learn the kinds of things and get a little bit more texture of what people are thinking and feeling locally and try to understand things. But I must say, I don't have a great grasp of that yet in the Twin Cities, but maybe just a brief little bit of prior experience that might spark the imagination a little bit. When I was at St. Louis U, which is located just off downtown St. Louis, and 200-year-old university there with a lot of history. and right on the brink of, I love that line about the address is the mission. That's the kind of thing that we talked about a lot at that particular university, because we're right at the crossroads between Black St. Louis and white St. Louis and South Side, between downtown and then before you get out to more affluent suburbs. And so in a lot of ways it was a real crossroads. So that helped to try to frame what the nature of the university was there too, to help us think about how are we serving in a place in this corner of the world that is at a crossroads. And one of the things we did early on, the mayor and the county executive at that time in St. Louis is totally fractured government between the city and the county, and there were 91 municipalities in the county, all divided, all sorts of different police departments, all sorts of both inefficiencies, and it was all driven by racism historically. And everybody always kind of knew that, but then when Michael Brown was killed in Ferguson, then those sorts of more systemic issues became much more widely known across the population, and it became the frequent kind of topics of conversation. And it was a lot of learning for me to start to learn some of that history locally. And the wounds that came out of not only his killing and all of the turmoil after that, but there was another officer involved shooting of another African-American man right off our campus, not long prior to that. And that created a whole other wave of turmoil. And one of the things that we talked about, I tried to frame from the perspective of a mission of a university, of a Catholic university at least, is in that dialogue with the mayor and the county executive and having other faculty members think about what are the needs that are confronting us now. I tried to draw a little bit from, I'm a Jesuit priest too, so part of the spirituality for us in giving retreats, there's a contemplation on the incarnation that we call it, where after you begin a retreat, you first look at the goodness of the world, the created beauty, everything's meant to be in harmony, and that lasts for about 2 pages in the Bible, and then everything falls apart, and all of the divisiveness and all of the fear and the blaming and the hatred and the violence starts to ensue. And how am I a part of that too? I'm recognizing that. At the core, I myself, every single one of us are created for that harmony, and I'm also a participant and sometimes a victim of this violence and divisiveness that happens. And then I can't get myself out of it. And so there's that tees it up for that contemplation on the incarnation, which is where St. Ignatius, one who wrote the spiritual exercises, says, invites the retreatant to now look at things from God's perspective, to look down upon the whole face of the earth, where things were meant to be in harmony and in communion in the human family and in all of creation. And from God's perspective, the whole thing's going down into hell. And God says there's a little conversation going on between the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, between the Trinity. Members of the Trinity, and God saying, I'm not going to let this whole thing fall apart, I'm going to do something about it. And we're going to enter into that human condition in all vulnerability, that kind of thing that was that Rob talked about coming from Pope Francis. The mystery of, first of all, having God's heart moved by what's happening in his own creation, and a sense of urgency about entering into the places where precisely things are so wounded, where the human condition is so wounded. And coming in smallness too. To me, that's on both a spiritual level, but also I think on a pretty practical level when it comes to the sorts of things we might talk about today. Coming not in great power to fix things, but coming in humility and in vulnerability. That turns out to be, I think, pretty effective. And that's good coming out of at least the Catholic imagination too. It's telling that God comes small and God comes vulnerable into the world and defenseless and starts to build relationship there with nothing else to rely on, no other places of security and so on. So that was all kind of nice and I think true spiritual and kind of theological framework. But then we started to see that really play out in all kinds of different ways. Carrying out the work in St. Louis from there, how important it is, I think, no matter where we are, no matter what our address is, to go to the places where that pain is in a very striking way. And then I'll just stop here. After that other sentencing happened of the other young man that was killed in St. Louis. That was our downtown law school was there. I went down to the law school to be just around as that sentence was being read, and people were gathering in the streets there, and I didn't know I had any plan. It just seemed important to be around, and then went down as the sentencing was read, and there was a little group of people on the sidewalk praying, and they called me over, and it was all ministers, African American ministers there, and they drew me into that place of prayer, and then we were soon in the middle of the intersection of the street, and I was kind of feeling awkward. This is not what I was looking to do today exactly. I don't know what I feel like a fraud here too. I don't know what I'm doing, but I can still feel the grasp around me of fellow clergy who are African American, and I'm white, and there we are in the middle of the street and holding on, and without a big plan to come out of it. And that remains a very formative experience. I still don't know what exactly to do with that, other than that was, I think, sacred ground for me to be drawn in there, and still looking for ways to try to be present, whether it's on an individual basis or to think about a whole institution where I work. How can we, as a whole institution, try to be present where there are places of that pain to, at the very least, begin in that place of solidarity, and then not knowing how things are going to play out, but that is somehow the way forward. It's at least has totally captured my imagination and vision, and trying to think about how that might be able to play out on a more local level for me here. So.
One of the things that Dean Vischer brought out that now that Father Collins is touching on, the work of restorative justice is really about proximity. It's about nearness, and it's about overcoming fear and just entering in and allowing yourself to be pulled in. Rabbi Zimmerman.
So I think there are so many things. I grew up in St. Louis in that racist world and struggled to get out as soon as I could, to never go back. And not that we don't have our own struggles here, of course we do. And I think for me, as formative years, I came to McAllister College. I did a semester in Chicago, where the first time I was brought into a workshop with a Black woman who made me confront my own racism, or encouraged me to confront my own racism. And it was a powerful moment, and it really is my paradigm even today, to say, you've got to begin with the own messages that we have gotten as white people, presenting white people. Jews were not white till the 1960 census, and we spoke a lot about that. Jews, the race was Jewish. That's what your race was. And in the 1960 census, we then checked off Caucasian, which I think was in some ways the beginning of the death of Judaism and our culture and our ethnicity and our vibrancy, because we work so hard to fit in and to be like the powerful and the privileged, and you lose your uniqueness. And I think that is a sad moment for me, because race is a social construct. It has nothing to do with anything else. Socially constructed, we could have decided hair color was where we were going to draw the lines. We could have decided eye color was where we were going to draw the lines, but we decided skin color. Well, not we, somebody, the powers that be. And that is where we can't forget that. And then created systemic realities to other people with darker shades of skin color. To the point, by the way, that Abraham and Sarah And Isaac and Rebecca come up as white in our children's books, and I can tell you, they weren't. They're from the Middle East. They were brown. Jesus was brown. That's racism. It is the ever-evolving reality that we have really gone astray. So that is some of my own journey and history, and I think for me, I struggle with it every day, and I have been talking about it since I was 20 years old, but as I continue to talk about it, it seems that there's more and more white fragility. What you felt was white fragility in that moment. And it is something we have to grapple with. We have to grapple with. And people of color are not our teachers about racism. We have to confront each other. They're not fair to have to be teachers. We have to confront each other and then pay people of color to teach us. But we don't expect our friends. One of my favorite pieces at Westminster Church was when, and I know she's a bit controversial, but Robin DiAngelo wrote an entire book about white fragility, so you should read it. And it's a complicated one, I know, for some groups. But the thing she said to me is, what she said to a group of people, 200 people, because it was a huge snowstorm. So 2,000 people had signed up, but only 200 made it downtown because of this horrible snowstorm. And she said, I want to talk to the white people in the room. How many of you, okay, imagine your last conversation about race. Who did you have it with? And so we all thought about it. And then she said, how many of you had a conversation about race with a person of color? We all raised our hands. She said, I want to talk to the people of color in the room. How many of you have been offended by those conversations, by your white colleagues, family, neighbors? And everyone raised their hands. That is, I think, the front row seat of healing that we need to make, at least from my experience. And I'd love to hear anyone who disagrees. But after the murder of George Floyd, so many white people woke up for a minute and a half and now are asleep again. Do you want me to say it? I mean, literally, it was like a seizable moment, and then now it's, and out on the streets, the anger and upset and discrepancies of opportunity came to the fore, and then that was a reason to go right back into fragility. I mean, right back in. And so we need to get a bit more muscle around the work we have to do. So that is one thing that I think is important. We have a front row seat with the murder of George Floyd, so does St. Louis, but I don't expect them to do anything, unfortunately. My family included. But we have a front row seat to the problem and the pain and the inequities, and we better have a front row seat to the solutions, because otherwise, we are absolutely a part of the problem. And as religious institutions, if we don't have a front row seat to the solutions, then we are absolutely continuing the systemic racism that I believe God would never accept. I believe that it is a human creation. Without question, it is. I mean, I don't want to hear anyone else's belief that's different. Sorry. But it is really, for me, our work. And I guess for me, that is it. We have a front row seat to the pain, and we better have a front row seat, because other than that, religion is then meaningless, irrelevant, and should not exist. All right, I'm done.
Ms. Massey.
You see, there's not a demure bone in my body. Have you figured that one out already?
That's why we invited you onto the panel.
I love it. Oh, I just have to start by saying today my heart is heavy, having listened to too much coverage of what's happened in Buffalo. So if I get emotional, I'm just telling you guys why. I am really burdened by the hate and the ugliness we've seen play out again in our country. You'd asked about, some of the challenges facing us, and I think we've heard really, really profound perspectives on some of the issues around race, and I think in many ways it goes to being able to connect and listen to each other. When I think of restorative justice, I think of bringing together the parties to a situation so that everyone is empowered to help fashion the remedy and the correction to that harm. And that principle plays out across the board in work we can do to address the long legacy of racism in this country. I grew up in Waco, Texas, and I had to smile when you said you wanted to get away. I couldn't wait to get out of Waco. And it's very different here in Minnesota. I have met so many wonderful people of goodwill. This place has more nonprofits than anywhere else I've ever lived or seen. People committed to doing good work. But we still have that distance between us. We live in separate bubbles. We don't connect and really actively listen to people who come from different backgrounds, races, experiences, income levels, in the way we need to in order to address many of the issues that face our community. And at the YWCA in St. Paul, we work with low-income communities of color in areas of significant racial disparity. So things like housing stability. We work with homeless families. It's jobs, and economic opportunity. It's academic achievement and opportunity. There are so many places where our internal biases, even when we're good-intentioned, well-intentioned people, lead to the creation of systems that inflict harm on folks, and there's not even an awareness of it, or at a minimum create unnecessary barriers to access. And those are the kinds of issues I think we have to work on, and they come across the board. And you can't name an area where you don't see it. Transportation, childcare, healthcare, workforce, housing, it's just across the board. And I think those are the challenges we really have to take up as a community. And as part of that, it requires connection to people who are affected, because they bring solutions, they bring understanding to issues most people don't even see. It's very easy to go through life and you never even recognize that these things are happening. And then when you hear it from someone, it's easy to dismiss because it's so far from your experience and not something you recognize, so it's easy not to really fully credit it. And so I think one of our big challenges is learning to listen and believe what people are telling you their experience is. I'll stop there.
Thank you. Commissioner Harrington.
Well, I thought you were going to take all the good answers, and probably you did. So
You have more.
Go for it.
I don't know if I've got more. But I will say there are two things that we're confronting, and I'll take this back a page. So I've been a cop since 1977. I laugh about that now because the people I've hired, my last chief that I helped get promoted was born the year I started in the job. And he and I think we see the world in entirely different ways because of the different generations. But we share two great issues that are confronting policing right now. And frankly, they're the same issues that I was confronting back in '77. And my guess is that when his kids follow him into the business, there'll be the same issues, unfortunately. And those two issues are fear and trust. I have people operating out of trauma and fear every day. And some of the ways they're operating is making them less safe. I run the Department of Public Safety, so the idea is that we're going to try and help make everybody safer, and yet what I find is that people that operate out of fear oftentimes make the decisions that make them far less safe than the alternative. And I'll give you two classic examples. Are you safer if you lock yourself in a glass blocked room, put 8 locks on the door so that nobody can get in, soundproof it so that you can't hear the screams from outside? Or are you safer sitting on your stoop in the front, having a cigarette or having a cup of coffee with your neighbors? Which are you safer as? A lot of people that I talk to would say, heavy doors, big locks, guns, dogs. And the answer is that unless you're in a relationship with your neighbors, you're isolated. You're on an island. That makes you vulnerable. The safest people, the safest time, I said this once to a legislative committee, the safest nights in my city, I'm a St. Paul guy, I cross the river and I know I have to go back because my passport will get revoked at some point, were the nights that the Wild were playing or the Saints were playing. The more people, good people that were out there on the streets, the safer we were. Which is counterintuitive because it seems like statistically there are more victims that are possible in that situation. But they're not. Because together we are safer. But in order to come together, we need one very hard but very simple ingredient. We need trust. I gotta trust that the person that's walking next to me isn't going to knock me on the head and take my wallet. I gotta trust that the person that's walking up to my car isn't gonna carjack me. And one of the big challenges we're dealing with in policing right now is I gotta trust that the cops are gonna do the right thing. And there is a dramatic shortage of trust. It's been replaced by fear. Where does the trust break down? What does it look like? It looks like crime victims in a neighborhood who don't call the police and don't tell anybody else because they don't trust that anybody is going to do a damn thing about their cases. If you don't believe that anything good can come out of telling your secrets, who do you tell them to? The answer is nobody. And if they stay a secret, then the bad guys win. Because the bad guys keep victimizing you because they don't have any reason to stop, because you haven't given them a reason to stop. But how do I build trust? And this speaks to, I think, a point that all of you were raised, and it's proximity. Blessedly enough for me and my misspent journey of my youth as a St. Paul cop, we were dabbling in community policing, which meant I walked a beat, which means that the large steel box driving at 40 miles an hour through the neighborhood was taken away. It meant that I was touchable by everybody on my beat. That they knew me not necessarily by a badge number, but they knew me by a name. And I will tell you, I used to laugh when I was running my district. I could tell when my cops were doing the right thing, because when I'd ask the community about, well, who's their cop? They wouldn't give me a badge number. They wouldn't even give me a name. They'd give me the nickname. Oh, that's Mustache. Yeah, he walks Selby. Oh, no. John Boy's over there. He's walking Frogtown every night. I know John Boy. They knew them by who they were. And because they had reached out and touched them, because they had reached out and touched the community, because we listened to each other and we were quiet in those moments where we were in community and relationship together, we heard each other's pain. We heard each other's passions. We heard each other need. And when you have that relationship between the cop and their community, you have trust. And from that trust, you get problem solving. And from that problem solving, you get safer communities. We have an enormous gap in trust right now between the cops and the community, and between community and community, quite honestly. There is so much trauma that what I see is the fear has widened that gap. And so our big challenge right now is to try and think about, how do I build a trusting relationship? We're having conversations with community right now that speak to that trusting relationship with the beloved community. Because without it, we are all in our little boxes, pretending that we're safe. And in reality, we are all vulnerable there.
Thank you to all four of you.
And can I
Sure,
add one more thing to extend it? It's what I'm afraid of is the fear and mistrust in institutions. Like, there's not an institution that isn't brought up for suspicion because of the acts of some people in each of those institutions. And to me, a society can't survive if there isn't trust in basic institutions. So I want to just extend what you're saying to that, because that to me is the crisis we're in as a nation.
No, I would absolutely agree. My ex-wife, who was the sex crimes investigator for St. Paul, and so we have 7 children. I want my children to go play hockey, play basketball, be scouts, go to Girl Scouts, go to church, do all those things. My wife investigates sex offenders. And you know what? There are coaches and priests and rabbis and everybody else that fit that category. So in her mind, nobody could be trusted. And I'm trying to think of, what kind of world am I going to send my children out into where they can never trust an adult? How do they learn to be good adults if they never have a trusting, caring adult in their life that gives a damn about them and is helping guide them down a path? That's part of that institutional piece, Rabbi, that I absolutely agree with you on.
Yeah, basic institution.
And staying, on the theme of trust, I'm reminded of an outreach. Councilmember Rainville, before he was Councilmember Rainville, connected me to a couple of folks at the Minneapolis Police Department. I had started pastoring an Ecuadorian community in Northeast, St. Cyril and Methodius, which was challenging because I don't speak Spanish. So in any event, wonderful people, but they were being targeted because of their status, being undocumented. And so the police were reaching out, and they came to the community. They came to the church to say, you can come to us. It's exactly what Commissioner Harrington was talking about. You can come to us. You can trust us if you are a victim of crime. We're not going to turn you into ICE, that this is about repairing whatever harm you've experienced. And it really strikes me that it's one relationship at a time. It's one initiative at a time as well. I want to stay with Commissioner Harrington and start to talk with all of our panelists about the question of community engagement. So this beloved community, I had heard from a couple of my colleagues that you were doing this outreach to religious leaders, and you could speak to that or any other community engagement that you're undertaking as commissioner, and what some of the insights you're able to gain from those dialogues and those engagement. And that'll be the question to the panel, the particular work of community outreach and insights that you're gaining in that work.
Well, The beloved community is the most recent example of a philosophy that was given to me by Michael Jordan. No, not that one. I'm a Chicago Bulls fan, but not that Michael Jordan. This is a little short guy who, in fact, worked for Honeywell, and he was the first black commissioner of public safety in the state of Minnesota. And Michael had come to work with the St. Paul Police Department, and Bill Finney asked him to help us reformat our mission. And I'm a very mission-driven person. Give me a mission and get out of my way. I'm going to try and take care of stuff. His mission was very simply to be responsive to and reflective of the community we serve. So I'm now the new commander. I'm running my district, and we have a string of drive-by shootings in the area. So I'm having a conversation with the community. What do we do about the drive-by shootings? It's a gang war between a couple of families. And I'm bemoaning the 2 o'clock in the morning calls where I get called out to a crime scene, and one of the ministers who created, in fact, he created the God Squad with me, which sounds like an odd, and it's probably heretical to say that. But in any case, we created this group called the God Squad, and what we discovered was if I sent my cops into a community where they weren't known, we got no answers. But who would be trusted by the community? The ministers in the community were the trusted players in the community. So the God Squad is created, and it is a matter of trust on both sides at this point. So we get another homicide, who do I call? Yes, I do call the homicide unit, but I also call Reverend Spence and Reverend Miller. And they show up. Who do I have to get them to trust? First of all, I got to get the cops to trust them to let them in the damn yellow tape. Because that's where my victims are. That's where my witnesses are. And if I just line them up and go, we're going to take you down to the station, we're going to take statements from you, I get zip. But if I let the ministers talk to them, I find out that cousin somebody did something to somebody, and there was a problem about a girlfriend, and somebody said something about that baby was ugly as sin. And by the time we get done, I know who the shooting was about, at least. And that gives us a place to start. Second piece of trust, though, is down at the hospital, I've got cousins and uncles and others who are all plotting the payback shooting. I need somebody that they will trust to chill that conversation down. Well, who do they trust? They going to trust me? They don't know me. They going to trust my cop from the beat? No, they're not going to trust my homicide guy either. But what we found out was and the shooters don't necessarily attend church regularly, but their mothers do. And since mom's at the hospital, her minister can get her to calm everybody else down. That began the process of a trusted conversation between us and the clergy. And I laughed your conversation because I went to the Archdiocese because I was having Latino gang issues at the time, and Father Kevin McDonough was the only Spanish-speaking Catholic priest I could find, because we asked that same question. Who in that neighborhood can I talk to who can talk to the family and be a trusted ally? Who can help bridge this gap, who can build the bridge between the community and the police department that really, I want to say, I really did want to be responsive to their needs. The other advantage of this, and I'll close with this comment, was that by making the church our bridge, we were able to be not just responsive to the community, but we were oftentimes able to be reflective of the community. Because I had the priest that was headquartered in that parish. I had the minister who preached at that church, who was with us at the basketball games and at the high school hockey games and all those other places. So they were part of the community. And a funny thing about that is they were often far more reflective of the community than my cops were. My cops were mostly white, mostly male. And even though there are departments I've run that are up to about 50%, that still doesn't make up the makeup of the Twin Cities. That's not who we look like. That's not even how this room looks like. So how do we bridge that gap? And the beloved conversations we're having, beloved community conversations we're having right now, were in fact just an extension of that to say, how do I bring the church and the community together with the police department to find the best way, the most trusting way to solve problems?
Well, I'll say that when I moved from corporate America into social service work, I learned a lot. And one of the things that has really, it's been something, I learned early in life, but has been so reinforced for me in the work that I'm doing now, is how important it is for people to be seen and to have hope, because hopelessness is deadly. It causes people to give up, to not care, to behave in ways that really reflect the trauma they've undergone in their lives. And I say that because one of the things that is so important is, and this is kind of reflective of what you were saying, is people need to be seen, to be heard, to feel enfranchised and empowered in their own lives. I don't know where I heard it, but that old saying about you're the hero of your own story. Well, lots of people don't feel like that. They don't feel that their challenges or obstacles are seen, or that they are seen. And so in our work, for example, with homeless families, most of them are headed by women with young children, and these are some of the most amazing young women I've ever met. They are scrappy, they are persistent, they want what's best for their families, for their kids, they work hard, but they have encountered a series of challenges that I don't know that I could have overcome. Abuse or mental health challenges in some cases, violence, poverty. I mean, it's dealing with life without resources, either financial or personal support. It's incredibly difficult. But the women who keep trying because they want more for their families, who with an embrace and support and a recognition of what they can achieve with that support and the hope that comes with that, are able to accomplish just about anything. And I've seen it over and over again. And it's so, you learn so much from people who overcome such significant challenges. I know, I'll speak for myself. I've had a blessed life and I know it. I felt like I've had significant challenges in my life, but they pale in comparison. I have to, step back and recognize that. And I've had support, a loving family. I've had friends who've helped me when I've needed it. I've had community. And many people don't have all of that in the ways they need it. And so I think, the insight I would bring is that when we begin to tackle these systemic challenges in our community that really need to be reworked so that people don't face unnecessary barriers, so people have access to what they need, so that we have a just society, we need to engage with the people who have had these experiences to tell us what's needed. That's the real insight I would offer. One of the worst things I've seen happen is when really smart, capable, well-intentioned people come to the table thinking they know the answers. If you haven't lived, if you haven't experienced something, you have something to learn from those who have. And coming with that open mind, heart, and humbleness, I can't remember who said that earlier, that's how you approach these situations and listen for all the insight you can gather from the real experts who are the people who have lived these challenges.
Thank you. That reminds me of the potential for restorative justice to lead to transformative justice. So my colleague Amy Levad, who's on our leadership team of our initiative, she teaches in the theology department at St. Thomas and St. Paul, says restorative justice, its orientation has to be transformative justice. And the listening to stories that Ms. Massey was talking about can hopefully move hearts, enlighten minds, and ultimately move to action. One other quick thing, my dad was watching a program we did at Our Lady of Lourdes, and it was the comment about the lack of hope. Marshall Collier is our Director of Secure Environment and was a longtime Minneapolis police officer. And that was the comment he made on a panel that we had. He said when he goes to North Minneapolis, he's seeing in the community too much of a lack of hope, and that leads to so much harm. But the more people can hear about stories of frankly, of harm, that it can move us to a point of transforming structures that persist in inequity. So Rabbi Zimmerman, thoughts on the question about community outreach and where we can make a difference?
So I love the teachers among us, right? Of the proximity of lived experience and listening to narratives that are different than your own, and to realize how much we filter what we see or what we hear through our own lens. And that is the work of restorative justice, is to hear the other. So I guess for me, I would say that the lesson is connecting between different communities. So Buffalo, this person went into a grocery store with primarily to hurt people of color, the Black community, but it was out of anti-Semitic, white racism, nationalism philosophy. And so we need to create community by creating bridges between communities, because people who isolate us are actually stopping that transformative work. So for me, it really is about connecting to communities. And one of my favorite images, it really helps understand racism, systemic racism, is out of a book called Why Do All the Black Kids Sit at the Same Table at Lunchtime or in the Cafeteria? And the author, Beverly, I forgot her last name, Tatum. Tatum, yeah, she's amazing. And what she says is that racism, systemic racism, is like a moving sidewalk, right? Where you begin on one end and on the other end is systemic racism. Some people are running to get there. White nationalists, people like the man who perpetrated this horrific crime in Buffalo, they're running to get to there. But many of us get on the moving sidewalk and continue on. We're going to end up at the same place. We're going to support that systemic racism. We have to literally make an effort to turn around and walk the opposite way every minute of every day. You don't just do it once. You have to do it every minute of every day. And I think that image is really important. How do we counteract what we swim in every day and aren't even aware of the millions of messages we get by just opening the newspaper, by turning on the television, by turning on the radio, all of those images that live in this world, and how do we turn around and walk the other way, question the most basic things. And I guess for me, it's the connection between communities and the questioning every minute, which doesn't make me always fun to be around, but you know.
I think, when you first asked the question about community engagement and maybe some of the practicals on that, what occurs to me is that it's helpful both on an individual basis, but maybe on an institutional basis too. On the one hand, when we look out into the world in all kinds of different ways, as we've been talking about, whether it's on healthcare disparities or there's violence or there's lack of hope and education problems and massive amounts of need, and then that's a different version of losing hope. Like, what can I do? What can any of us do? And then we can get, I think, whether it's on an individual basis or on a communal basis or institutional basis, we can get discouraged there. And it's good to, obviously, it's good to keep paying attention to where those wounds are and where those needs are, but also the conversations, whether it's in my own heart or in small groups or in intermediate associations and faith communities or neighborhoods or what businesses, whatever it might be, to think about, well, what are the assets that we do have in our own, wherever I am, wherever the little corner of the world is that I'm occupying. What are we good at? What are we strong at? Where do we have energy? Well, then that's the kind of thing that we can make contributions to. And then, but also not to start steamrolling forward and say, well, we've got all these answers and ways to solve things, but appreciate where the strengths are and then begin that kind of ongoing, infinite amount of listening that's necessary out in the community, wherever that might be, to say, what are the ways that we could try to make a contribution here and listen with greater depth as to where those needs are and where there might be marriages possible of the assets that we've got in this community and then the needs in this part of a different community. And it's an ongoing process of discernment, it seems to me, and it's infinite amount of possibilities that can start to come forward. But then you also start to, I think, feel some agency and also build those relationships, because you're also putting yourself out there into arenas that you don't know anything about, even though I might have this skill or something that might be useful. Just couple quick examples. When I was when I was at St. Louis U, I just anecdotally, I'd learned about a bunch of different faculty that we had a prison education program that had started years ago. And I thought, that's interesting. I'd like to learn about that. And what do they do and how did that come about? Well, that was one person that wanted to start trying to offer education within a state prison, and he wanted to help offer courses that would be a boost for those who are incarcerated. But then in going to the DOC, then they said, well, if you only offer to those who are incarcerated, that's going to create a lot of resentment with the correctional workers. And so that was a good learning moment for him too, and paying attention. So they started to craft a little bit of a program that would be both for the correctional workers as well as those who are incarcerated. And then it became like this ongoing kind of process of really transformative experiences for everybody involved, most especially for the faculty that were doing that. Well, in other parts of the university, there were people that got inspired by that, but from an occupational therapy angle, they made relationships at the city jails and said, well, with the kind of thing that we can do as occupational therapists has to do with life habits and not just physical things, but life skills and habits and practicing and so on. That might be helpful for those who are being released from the jails, that are being released more frequently than out of the prison. So is there something maybe that we could try to offer within the city jail that might be helpful for people before they get released in terms of things that are going to be applied to employment or housing or basic finances and so on? And that became a different kind of experience. I remember going to one of those kind of graduation ceremonies that they had within the workhouse in St. Louis. And that was a group of women that had spent months with other women in these real practical life skill kind of training experiences. And going to that graduation just before they were being released out into the community, it was an unbelievable experience. Talk about transformative experience for the young women and those who had been part of the educational process. It was like a new life. People had paid attention. They had been seen and recognized that they had assets to build on. And it wasn't always coming from a deficit approach, like what's wrong with you? You got to fix what's wrong with you. Instead, it was totally built on what are the assets that can be built upon. And it was just an unbelievable experience to witness that. So something about, I mean, I would put it in terms of kind of vocation. What's my vocation? What's our community's vocation? And you can't do everything, and that's okay because other people do other things too. The nonprofits, you talk about the nonprofits here. I think St. Louis had 22,000 nonprofits. There are like 300,000 people that live in the city. I don't know how there can be that many nonprofits, but the generosity is there. But it's what are the assets that we've got? But that's the key moment, though, is not to just say, okay, I know what the problems are and go fix it. But it's all about knowing the assets and then listening to where the marriage might be.
But there's an interesting question that you bring up, and that is the incarceration perspective, because my daughter lived in Spain and worked in a jail in Spain, and there was a whole different kind of system. As 6 months as people were being, had served their time, the 6 months before they were released, whatever, like the whole idea of that is ridiculous, because you go out into this world in our system that isn't helpful. But in Spain, 6 months you go home every weekend and you come back and you get the support that you need to understand what it means to bridge in that time. And over 6 months of that time, you are going in and out and in and out and gaining the support that people need. So it's so that other countries have incredible systems that we just get into this, I think, in this country, we think we do it all so right, when we could learn from so many different places in the world that do it, I think, with some more compassion and understanding.
Yeah,
so I just want to say there are other systems
Part of that may come
learn
from
a lot.
what Gaye mentioned, which is you learn from the people who have the lived experience. So
That's right.
I helped set up a program called Ujama Place, which is Swahili for extended family. Ujama Place, the premise of it was, let's ask the guys that are just getting out of the joint, what would they need to stay out? Because that was really our mission. Okay, you're going to get out, you did your time, whatever it is. How do we keep you out of the joint and make you productive into, what we normally think of as normal productive citizens? And they gave us a very clear list. We need a driver's license, I need my child support, I need to see my kids, I need housing, I need to get my education. They gave us the answers. And it was amazing to us is once we started working with them to provide what they said they needed, we have it's better than that actually. It's like we've had 5 guys out of 4,000 that have gone back to prison. It's 7 out of 10. If the state releases you, it's 7 out of 10 go back. We've had 5 out of 4,000 go back. And that's because we were listening though. We were listening to the lived experience of, I've been sleeping on a bus for the last month and I can't get a job if I'm sleeping on a bus. Okay, so I'm couch hopping, I'm not eating, I got no nutrition, I got no assets. How do I fix that? But the answer came from listening to the people that were living that rather than, us as experts saying, well, we're the criminologists, we know what you need. And like, nah, I've never had to sleep on the bus.
I think
That
Ujama
was
Place is
a-
a perfect example.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the way those models can evolve because of that listening, exactly. Even at pretty systemic levels, an experience in St. Louis was the federal chief probation parole office and the U.S. attorneys, from their perspective, kind of amazingly kind of a progressive group on the federal level at least, that used to work on doing career fairs for those who are coming out of federal incarceration. And then when the economy tanked in 2008, they can't do the career fairs anymore. They started doing training programs. But anyway, that evolved into a few years back when we were doing this. He said, now's a good time because there's a huge labor shortage in St. Louis at that time, and so industry needs labor, and so let's figure it out. And so the asset that we've got are people who have skills coming out, and there's a need that's being on that front, on the employment way, and so the university helped facilitate these career fairs and that would be targeted to certain employers that would be the right kind of fit, and then that's turned into online versions of these career fairs. So it was amazing to have the U.S. attorney, the prosecutors, the probation parole officers, the social agencies involved, and the businesses all rowing in the same direction. It was an amazing experience, and the great thing was because it was practical for everybody too. You know, I mean, I think that's a part of it too. The vocation can be certainly a meaningful and spiritual sort of thing, but if it's really going to take flesh, it's got to be practical and mutually beneficial for the parties involved, which comes out of that learning and ongoing dialogue too. So. And
I think that to Rabbi Zimmerman's point about outcomes and not becoming groove runners, lawyers and the criminal justice system can be that, where we just keep doing the same thing and the outcomes show to be disastrous for people and communities. The point that Commissioner Harrington made about lived experience, and that's been named by a number of panelists. I think of our late friend Tom Johnson and Ricardo, one of our student fellows, is the Tom Johnson Student Fellow for our initiative. Tom was a longtime Hennepin County attorney and then ran the Council for Crime and Justice. And when we would set up a program at Our Lady of Lourdes on homelessness or whatever the topic, reentry, he would always say, he was on the Justice and Charity Committee, okay, do you have someone who has had that experience who will be part of that conversation? This goes to Gaye's point about, not having people just say, here's what you need, but rather have that be kind of an organic, based on their experience. I want to drill down a little bit on culture in Minnesota. So we know that there, and not everybody knows this, and we need to know this as Minnesotans, the great disparities across all of these different categories when it comes to race. We saw this in the Catholic Church and you see it throughout the global Catholic Church. The same type of dynamic in terms of ecclesial culture would end up harming victim survivors, no matter what country you were dealing with. And you could almost, the pattern was so clear. Well, it's a matter of culture, and often a closed clerical culture that produces harm. In the case of Minnesota, I'm in Lauderdale, is where I live, and I walk around the neighborhood and I see Black Lives Matter signs on almost every house or every other house, and that's great. But what are we doing about that reality that every single human life has dignity, and yet we have these significant disparities that continue to be countenanced and continue to persistently affect people of color? What is it about Minnesota culture that produces harm in this regard? And are we taking enough of a look at our particular culture that has produced harm and significant disparities? Any insights from any of the panelists? We'll just throw it open in terms of our particular culture and why we have these significant disparities and are really an outlier.
Did you realize that none of us are from here?
I'm not either.
Maybe anybody out there?
I think it's actually hubris. I think that we perceive ourselves, and I do, we have so many, nonprofit organizations. We have a great welfare. It's one of the reasons why I came to McAllister. There is such a great welfare support system that I was at the YWCA to be trained in crisis management and crisis phone calls for rape victims and battered women when I was at McAllister, and I was, and all of these possibilities, and the feminist caucus, and I did, an internship there, and there were so many things, and I began to take on the narrative that we are somehow better. And I think when you have that perspective, then you read the world and read what's happening and let things really fall apart. And I've had a really hard time acknowledging we've never been what my perception was. And that has caused me a sadness and a grief and a shame. And I think that is one of the things that I don't think it's the only thing, but I do think that our inability to really look reality in the eye and say, no, we are not that, we are this, and to then begin to change. I think that, to me, has been a real learning.
Real quick, there's been times where I've raised this, and no offense to native Minnesotans, but my native Wisconsin and certainly Milwaukee has had significant issues with regard to racial justice. But sometimes when I've raised this with native Minnesotans, folks don't want to talk about it. Right. It is either a source of shame or it flies in the face of self-perception. Yeah. I asked a fellow once at a tree trimming party, I said, why is this in Minnesota? He said, because we're racist. That was his response. He said,
those aren't native Minnesotans.
That particular fellow
No, but
was.
I mean native Minnesotans are native indigenous people, right? So you're not talking about
Yes, thank you.
I just want to make sure we're all clear about
Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
But other thoughts from our panel about, you are apparently all grew up somewhere else. I didn't know that when I asked you to be on the panel, but I think you bring a unique perspective given that. Any thoughts with regard to where these significant disparities are rooted culturally, possibly, and why they continue to persist?
I think in some ways, it's also the human condition. Like all of us have, whether it's on an individual level or an ethnic level or a family level, a narrative that is preferably a romantic narrative of whatever my family is like or my group is like, and then you run into reality sometimes, and then things fall apart. I mean, that's also, I think, just the ongoing nature of being a human being. I had some family members, aunts, uncle, went to Scotland years ago because the great-grandfather was from Scotland, so they had a very romantic notion of the Donaldson family in Scotland, so they went to the local pub where the Donaldsons came from and asked about the Donaldsons and tell us about them. And oh yeah, they were pig thieves. Yeah, like so. I mean, there's some version of a self-satisfaction that I want to keep hold of, and then life hits, and then we have encounters, and then you correct. And so I don't know exactly what to say about Minnesota specifically, but I also kind of think it's just a human reality that's ongoing.
I rip off of the rabbi who, Lieutenant Governor Peggy Flanagan has often remarked to me that the good old days weren't all that good for a whole bunch of people. Right. And if you think about what the good old days, whatever that epoch was for you, when women couldn't vote, when I was property, when there would have been segregation by race and gender and by religion. It's hard for me to frame that as the good old days, but I also recognize that I grew up south side of Chicago. I have very fond memories of the south side of Chicago. Now, I know on a statistical basis, it's one of the most dangerous places in the world to live. I was in Mogadishu. There were less murders in Mogadishu during the war than there were on the south side of Chicago. But for me, it was Thule Park, and we played basketball, and we played street football, and my parents knew where I was, and if they yelled out the door, and it was around the time the street lights came on, I knew I had to get my butt home. It was home. Now, from folks that didn't grow up there, they would drive into the south side of Chicago with a great deal of trepidation. I think Minnesota has some of that same nostalgia and some of that romance that you mentioned, that we think of, yeah, we can frame this as the good old days. But if we really think about what was going on, that's got some real ugly components to it. And on balance, it doesn't seem quite so sanguine as it may be portrayed in Garrison's portrayal of Lake Wobegon. So,
Yeah, I think there's a natural inclination to avoid hard things, hard conversations, difficult history, and most people don't learn the history that created institutionalized racism in school. You just don't learn it. You have to make an effort to go out and find out about those things. And I think Minnesotans are very nice. I remember when I moved here, I had never been around people who were so polite. And, I learned in many settings, there'd be conversations, you'd ask a question directly, and people weren't uncomfortable. The indirectness and kind of gently approaching a topic seemed to be more effective. That was my personal experience. And I just think those things together, feeling like this is a good life here, we've had a great history, we shy away maybe from some of the tougher conversations, and we're isolated. We all live in our own little worlds and communities and networks of friends and family, and Minnesotans are very rooted with their families too. As an outsider coming to the state, it was tough to establish networks, not because people weren't nice, but because people had their friend groups and their family, and they didn't need extra people in that number. So, people would tell you where to go to find something, but not invite you to be in their circle. So I think all of those things contribute to it, and I think it is, and I think people in this country are taught that kind of a privileged, I'm just going to say it, white experience is normative, and others' experience, you have to really make an effort to know anything about it. It's not part of the norm and the history that's taught. So I think it's kind of, I don't think it's surprising that that's where we are, but I do have real hope that people, the real uptick of interest we saw after George Floyd was murdered and people trying to understand the history in this state and in these cities that led to the disparities we have now, that led to the fractious relationship between communities of color and police in many places. People really wanted to know and made an effort. And as you said earlier, a lot of that has now waned and we're kind of back to status quo. But I'm hoping that people will continue to make that effort to educate and then figure out how they can contribute to solutions, because that's the only way we move the dial on any of these big issues, is unless we all make that effort together.
Great, thank you to all of you. Just quickly, and if there are questions, we can go around and collect any written questions here. To Rabbi Zimmerman and Father Collins on the question of faith, wisdom from faith traditions. So I had told Rabbi Zimmerman that one of the areas that, and I know Chris teaches in this area as well, is Catholic social teaching is really rooted in the biblical ethic that is seen as a thread across both testaments. But Hebrew scripture provides such a beautiful foundation and a challenging foundation in terms of how we're to respond to the plight and need of our neighbors. So first to Rabbi Zimmerman and then to Father Collins, what type of wisdom comes from the Jewish faith that can really be helpful in responding to harm and building a more inclusive community?
So I'll have two pieces. One is we are in the book of Leviticus. Every year the Jewish community reads Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, and then in the fall we start all over again. And so we're reading it, the tradition of the Protestant community, a lexicon, there's a lexicon, but we every year read the 5 books of Moses, which is considered to be our Torah, our most sacred text. And we just read a Torah portion, Kedoshim, which means holiness in Hebrew, and is in the middle of the book of Leviticus. What's Leviticus? A lot of laws, a lot of detail about, if you sin, you bring this. If you want to be Thanksgiving, you bring this sacrifice. It's a lot of ancient thing that seems irrelevant in many ways. Not so much actually, but it really is so interesting, the laws of Leviticus. But in the middle of Leviticus is this amazing Torah portion that says, "V'ahavta l're'echa kamocha." Love your neighbor as yourself. Humans do not live by bread alone. Do not put a stumbling block in front of the blind or speak ill of the deaf. Just because you can get away with something, you still don't do it. Don't put an ox and a horse or a donkey to plow your earth because the donkey can't keep up with the ox, and you are actually being hurtful to that animal, so much the more so to human beings. Tzedek, tzedek tirdof. Justice, justice you shall pursue. There are so many different wise statements about how we should live. In Judaism, Torah says it because we don't do it. Because Torah knows us. Torah isn't this pie in the sky reality. It knows human beings and directs them to do what's right. We have to be told, but that we can't accept that we are both good and bad. That's in every human being. I did a psychoanalytic study over these last 3 years and received a certificate of psychoanalytic study. And Melanie Klein is a protege of Freud, one of the many different people who kind of emerged out of the unconscious and what Freud brought to the world, which is pretty remarkable. And she says that we all have good and bad, shame and joy. We all have those complicated realities, which is very Jewish. That's why all analysts, not all today, but the original ones were Jewish. It's very Jewish. We have a good inclination and an evil inclination. We can all be evil, every single one of us. We can all be angelic. Those extremes are not good. To be angelic when there's injustice is not good. To not accept that we have the evil in us and that we also moves us to compete, to procreate, to do all those things that are actually beautiful out of that evil inclination. There is a balance in Judaism, which is so psychoanalytic. And so here we have a theology of what it means to come to terms with ourselves in order to come to terms with a just society. God says, when you do these things, love your neighbor as yourself, you are being holy because I, Adonai, am holy. You are created in God's image. Now you've got to live that. That's what Judaism teaches. So there's so many. So the two things were psychoanalytic study and Torah, which are probably my 2 sacred texts. But there is a great deal to say. So that would be, so Judaism, and then we create the Talmud, which is the time of the New Testament, right? It's all about mitigating our behavior that is selfish, that is seen in our own image. It's not horrible, it's human condition, it's okay. And we are taught in our sacred text how to live justly. You see a lost animal in the middle of the street, you don't get to just pass it by. You have to take it. You have to take care of it. You have to do your best to make sure you find the owner. If your ox scores my ox, we have something we have to do because it's how we treat each other. Loving your neighbor, love, isn't just a concept. You can say, I love you to your children, but if you forget to pick them up at the hockey rink after they have hockey practice, love doesn't really show up. So those are the kinds of things on the ground and theologically. That's why I love Judaism. That's why I appreciate other traditions, but too many times, in my experience, Christianity puts Judaism as law and Christianity is love. Everything is love and law. And law is about picking your kid up at the hockey rink. You better do it, right? So, and you love them. Both are true.
My brother forgot to pick me up at kindergarten one day, and I had to walk home.
Well, but that's a sibling. There is no responsibility to love your siblings. No, I'm joking.
Well, my mom
Or the smell of the
my mom
hockey
told him
equipment.
there was an obligation.
There you go. No, I'm joking.
But I'm over it. It's all okay.
Yeah, we have the Cain and Abel. You know, there is sort of something there.
I kind of got into it a little bit already, but for me, it's and very much related. It's the solidarity that God enters into with humanity, right when we don't deserve it. Right, as St. Paul says, precisely when we're sinners. That's when that's the mystery, is that God comes to us and comes in smallness and in vulnerability, and it's that solidarity that God enters into with us. And then it's the solidarity, that term gets picked up much later on, or gets kind of established later on within Catholic social teaching. But I think it's kind of interesting there that solidarity is not just a principle, or it's not just an idea to try to follow. I should try to be in solidarity with my brothers and sisters and those who are different and those who I don't understand and so on. It's not just an idea to shoot for, it's a habit to be practiced. And I think that was, to me at least, that was kind of a helpful insight when I was kind of learning a little bit more about this. It's a daily practice, getting myself out of myself, or my group, or my church community, or my faith community, whatever it might be, my company, my university. We have to go out of ourselves, and that's a habit to be practiced, and that's where those places of the listening and the ongoing kind of relationship building happens. And to me also just the model of, I like the way, let's say in the Gospels, the way Jesus mostly just kind of roams around. It doesn't seem like there's any big master plan that he's got. I like, at least my interpretation of it, is that he just moves around, and whoever he encounters, that's who he needs to encounter, and mostly offering encouragement and healing and being known and recognizing dignity in people and bringing people back into the community, and then occasionally running into very self-satisfied people, and then he really lets them have it. So it's a combination of the ways that the person of Jesus operates, and I think ideally the way that church would operate, ideally the way I would operate too, is we don't have to have everything figured out ahead of time, but go out of myself every day, going out of myself, and whoever I encounter and however I'm going to encounter, I can trust what happens there and practice that habit of solidarity. And I'm never perfect at it, and none of us are ever perfect at it either. So.
And I'd like to go back to something that Father Collins said at the outset, is that way God enters into solidarity with our humanity in the smallness, in Bethlehem, in a vulnerable infant. And there's so much of a lesson there. I don't think I grasp, and it's still learning as a priest, as a minister, but how important that is to our particular faith tradition and instructive for us. We've got a lot of questions here and some really good ones. So I want to ask our panelists, there's one question about our budgets in Minnesota or in the city of Minneapolis or Hennepin County. It was recently pointed out to me how important it is to look at our budget and how we spend our money. Does this spending reflect our values, our goals of anti-racism and restorative justice? Can we speak, and maybe Commissioner Harrington wants to speak about this, or others, where are we spending our money, and is it reflective of values or things we should be spending money on, and where can we grow in these areas?
I'll take a quick shot at this because I have learned from my governor, Tim Walz, who started out, I think our first conversation, he made the comment that budgets are not just fiscal documents, they're moral documents. And they really speak to what you value is what you put into the budget. So in our case, in the governor's case, there's billions of dollars going toward K-12 education. That makes absolutely sense. He's a school teacher. That shouldn't surprise anybody. There are hundreds of millions of dollars going directly to community to do prevention, intervention, and targeted enforcement. Because crime isn't a simple problem of saying we're just going to prevent everything bad that happens. We have to hold people accountable, but we don't want to do it in a blanket fashion. There is billions of dollars that we're going to go to housing and health and human services, and I was so happy to see him put millions of dollars into domestic violence work, both in housing and supportive activities there. I think what you see in the governor's budget is a moral document of where he believes the needs of the community are and where the state has a role in trying to address those needs. Where we end up in the budget will be as much a political statement as it is a moral statement, though, and that's the reality of divided legislature, which we're one of, I think we may be the only state.
I think we are the only.
We're like the only state in the country where it's not a unilateral body. And so there are value judgments and there are discussions, and we have about 6 days left.
The federal government, yeah. We'll see what happens in the midterm elections, but
We will.
yeah.
So one question is on the topic of critical race theory, and the point that the person makes is that it's really a subject for academics in college. It's something we take up. I teach jurisprudence. It's part of, that's really where it began in jurisprudential thought. So the question is, how do we, if there is this great kind of response or almost this kind of false narrative that this is being taught everywhere, which I don't think appears to be the case, how do we teach our children about race in America in a way that is true, in a way that transforms hearts and minds, in a way that leads to a more just society? How do we do that when we're in this hyperpolarized culture that we're in, and we see it very significantly in education and the battles over education? Any thoughts on how we do that, and our churches and communities of faith, places where that can be done?
But I think,
Thoughts down?
I'll take a crack at that. When people talk about critical race theory and much of the debate I've seen, it has no relation to what critical race theory truly is. It's a model of analysis developed for law students. And law schools have really been the place where it has been taught. And it's a way of understanding systemic racism in our country. I think it has been, the term is now used to describe anything touching on race, any teaching of history, any discussion of values, anything to do with race in this country and the problems that racism has created for our country. That's where people get touchiest about not wanting those discussions to happen, not wanting anyone's feelings to be hurt by those discussions. I was almost incredulous when I saw laws being proposed to outlaw teaching of things that might hurt a student's feelings. I don't know how you get more vague than that. I don't know how you intimidate teachers better than that. And we've talked a lot tonight about the need for people to understand history and the barriers that public policy has created for certain segments of our community, mostly people of color, intentionally put in place, sometimes very clearly with an intent to inhibit progress, like around home ownership and racial covenants there, sometimes unintentional. The impact was unintentional, but the impact was there. And if you don't understand that history, if you don't understand why our country is the way it is now, you have no hope of addressing these problems effectively, because you attribute to the people whose opportunities have been stymied a lack of initiative or intelligence or capability, because you can't understand any other reason why they're not doing better and why they're always struggling, and that just doesn't make any sense if they worked harder or were more like somebody else. And so I feel pretty passionately that we've got to understand our history, be honest about it. There's nobody living right now who was involved in a lot of the stuff that happened, in this country. They are not to blame, but everybody needs to recognize the systems that have been set up that benefit some and not others. And we need to work together to make repairs. So I don't know if that answers the question really, but I think the critical race theory, the usage of that term now is a boogeyman. I don't think it has any relation to the true theory, what it is. It's not taught in elementary school. No elementary school student could possibly understand what it means. It's a law school construct. It's what's taught in elementary school is history about race and policies around race. And sometimes, and in many places, nothing is taught, but where it is, people are trying to help kids understand the world they're inheriting, because they're going to be cleaning up a lot of mess from, their parents and grandparents. And my kids tell me that all the time. You baby boomers have just ruined the world, but so that's my stab at that.
And I really, as a Gen Xer, I really don't think you have.
Gen Xers have their own set of problems.
Yes,
but,
yes, we do. Yes, we do.
We could go into that
No,
as baby boomers.
That would be that psychoanalytical approach.
Yeah, I could psychoanalyze. But I also want to
That's the next forum.
Right,
yeah.
that's the next program.
I want to say a couple of things. Rabbi Dr. Abraham Joshua Heschel, who marched with King, left Nazi Germany, brought to this country as a scholar, said, and Michael O'Connell quotes this all the time, some are at fault, but all were responsible. And I think that's what I want to say, is that we all are responsible for perpetuating it and perpetuating systemic racism. It doesn't make us bad people because we are on that moving sidewalk and you're here, so we're turning around and walking the other way. We are doing that work and we should feel proud of it, but we should never let down our guard about turning around and walking the other way. So I think that's one thing I want to say. The other thing is, children at a very early age realize when people are being othered and ostracized. And when they see that, they think to themselves, oh my goodness, those kids, it's how white kids can be mean, you know, like we're always surprised. Oh, kids can be mean. Yeah, kids can be mean. That we're human, right? At any age. And they say to themselves, what do I do not to be othered or ostracized? So they say, even from a very young age, infants understand racism when a parent who is white holds their child closer if a person of color is walking past. You communicate racism from the very get-go of what we do to raise our children. Kids below the age of 3 will play with others who are like them, look like them. By age 3, everybody wants to play with the white kids. Why? Because that is valued. We communicate that to our youngest among us. That is systemic racism. That is a problem. That's what we have to fight against all the time, because we as white people who have white privilege lose out on the beauty of this world, on the beauty of culture, of music, of creativity, of other communities. We lose out, and that is to our loss. So I just want to say the beauty of celebrating the diversity that God created. I say it's not a God problem, it's a people problem, so we can fix it.
With God's help. Very briefly, just a quick snippet from each of our panelists. One practical thing that we can do, those in the room, to help build a more just and inclusive Minnesota and Twin Cities community, and foster healing. And we know that peace follows justice. It's the fruit of justice. But one thing we'll start with, we'll start on the other end with Commissioner Harrington, and then we'll end with Father Collins.
Trust. I think that's my short answer is we have to build relationships, and we have to break down fear and come back to where we trust your gut. I used to teach that when I was teaching self-defense. If you feel like something's not right, you're probably right. But you have to start to trust at some point. And I think that's for me the most important thing we're doing by having these conversations is we're building trust again.
It's a really good one. I would urge all of you to take some kind of action. Everybody in this room is concerned and engaged, or you wouldn't be here. Take that into community in some form of service. Volunteer with a nonprofit, work. It can be an issue you know something about or you care about, or one you want to learn about, and engage and help those. There are a lot of people in community doing good work. Help, contribute your time, your treasure, help people kind of fight this fight so that we can tackle these big issues in areas of disparity in the state.
Thank you.
Be in relationship with people who are different religions, different ethnicities, different race, different understanding of the world. Be in relationship. Push your churches, your synagogues, your mosques to be in multicultural, multi-faith experiences. Make sure you show up and make sure you get uncomfortable, because the work has to be through some discomfort. And so I guess it's the experiences that are important.
I'd say something kind of similar, maybe where it's manageable locally, whether it's in your church or family or whatever it might be. Back to that thing that I mentioned before. What are the strengths or assets or gifts that we have? And take some time kind of considering what that is, and then make that deliberate move to go out of ourselves and start learning, and especially into places that are uncomfortable, to learn where is it that we might be able to make a contribution? It might turn out very differently, but at least I'd say it's kind of starting with the kind of asset question and then going out into places where it's more vulnerable to see where those gifts might be put to use. So.
Great. I want to thank our panelists for a wonderful dialogue and discussion today. You are all welcome to stay. We have cookies and coffee and water and continue the conversation. I want to thank those not only present here today, but also on the live stream. If you have any ideas about how we can continue this conversation via programs and ideas for engagement this coming fall and moving forward, please contact Julie Craven or me in terms of the work of the Initiative on Restorative Justice. Please look for upcoming programs of IRJH this coming year, including a talk by Notre Dame Professor Daniel Philpott this September at St. Thomas on the use of truth and reconciliation processes to help heal wounds in the Catholic Church and those harmed by the Church. I want to thank Dean Rob Vischer for his support of this program, the Basilica of St. Mary, including Father Bauer and the staff and many parishioners of the Basilica who are here today in their support of this event. Also, Father Chris Collins in the Office of Mission at St. Thomas. A big thank you to the IRJH leadership team, our advisory board led by Chair Mary Novak, who is herself an advocate for justice, Julie Craven, Hank Shea, and Amy Levod, and our student fellows Ricardo Johnson and Emma Schrum, who, by the way, as of Saturday, are now law school graduates. So congratulations to Ricardo and Emma. A shout out to all of those working in the area of restorative justice. This is a hub in the Twin Cities. And Tina Siegel was signed up. She's with Restorative Justice Community Action. And so we thank her and those in this area. And also just want to end with a prayer today as we ask God to continue to guide us and guide our efforts. God of goodness, light, and justice, we reach out to you today as we live with the pain of division, sin, and violence. Heal our wounded community, heal our wounded nation. Inspire us and transform our hearts so that we can be more holy, more kind, more humble, and more just. Help us to see your divine image in all of our sisters and brothers, and to work for the flourishing of all people and all communities. Send your Spirit down upon us, so that guided by fraternity and our common humanity, we would work together to build a more inclusive and peaceful community. We know that you are our loving and true God, and you are particularly present to those who suffer. May we always follow you in extending the same goodness and tenderness to others that you have graciously shown us. Amen. And please join me in thanking our panelists for their wonderful wisdom and conversation.